The restaurant fell silent the moment the wealthy businessman laughed and told his companions he would hire anyone who could properly translate a single Quranic verse in classical Arabic. He never expected the young waitress, refilling his water glass, to quietly set down the pitcher and say she would like to try. What happened in the next 3 minutes would leave a man worth $400 million weeping at a corner table, and it had nothing to do with the translation itself. It was the voice she used, a voice he had not heard in 30 years. Sarah was not supposed to be there. She had traded shifts with a coworker, desperate for every extra dollar. Her father, a scholar of classical Arabic who fled Baghdad with nothing but his books, had spent her childhood teaching her the language of the Quran. He died 3 years ago, drowning in medical debt, leaving her with a waitress job and a voice she had no use for until tonight. That language, buried under double shifts and exhaustion, was about to surface, and the man who had laughed at the idea that a waitress could translate a sacred verse was about to hear a voice he thought he would never hear again. The Al-Andalus restaurant on that Tuesday night was a place where two worlds never touched until the joke. Crystal lanterns hung low over tables draped in white linen, and the air smelled of saffron, grilled lamb, and sweet mint tea. Wealthy patrons from Dubai, Riyadh, and Doha filled the room, their conversations a murmur of business deals and oil futures. In the far corner, Khalid Al-Mansur lifted his glass of pomegranate juice and laughed louder than anyone else. He was 55, with a fortune that crested $400 million, and he had never learned to keep his voice down. His 3 companions, 2 investors from Jeddah and a London-based art dealer, leaned in, amused. Khalid had been holding court all evening, telling stories about his climb from nothing, dismissing everyone who lacked his killer instinct. A young server had just delivered a plate of meze, and one of the investors made a passing remark about the declining standards of religious education in the West. That was when Khalid set down his glass and made the joke that would haunt him. "These people study Arabic for years and still butcher the Quran," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room. "Tell you what, I would hire anyone in this restaurant who can properly translate a single classical verse for me right now, not the watered-down English. The real meaning with the old grammar, the way it was meant to be heard." He laughed, and the others laughed with him, because the idea that a random waitress or busboy could do such a thing was absurd. They didn't notice the young woman standing 3 tables away, her tray balanced on one hand, her entire body gone still. Sarah Ibrahim had switched shifts with a coworker at the last minute. She was 23, with tired eyes and hands that moved quickly but never spilled anything. The extra $40 that night would cover her father's final hospital bill, the debt that had followed her like a shadow for 3 years. She wasn't supposed to hear the joke. She wasn't supposed to care. But the words hit her chest like a physical blow because classical Arabic was not an academic subject to her. It was the language her father had poured into her bones. Ibrahim Jassim had been a professor of linguistic theology at the University of Baghdad before the invasion, before the chaos that drove his family across borders. He arrived in Chicago in 2004 with nothing but a worn suitcase, 3 volumes of Quranic commentary, and a 6-year-old daughter who held his hand and asked why people in the new country spoke so fast. The university degrees meant nothing here, so he worked nights as a janitor and spent his days teaching Sarah. Not just Arabic, the old Arabic, the language of the Quraysh, of the revelation, of poets and jurists who lived 1,000 years before either of them was born. Their apartment was a cramped 1-bedroom in Rogers Park. The radiator hissed all winter. But every evening, Ibrahim would open his oldest book, a tattered copy of Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, and Sarah would climb onto his lap. He taught her the difference between a fatha that bends the soul and a fatha that merely opens the throat. He made her recite until her pronunciation flowed like water over smooth stone. "This language is not only sounds," he would say, his voice gentle but urgent. "It is the exact expression of divine precision. Change one haraka and you change the will of God." By 10, Sarah could parse classical poetry that graduate students struggled with. By 14, she had memorized the last 10 surahs with full vowel charting. It was their secret world, a refuge from the exhaustion of poverty, from the neighbors who assumed her father was just another immigrant who couldn't speak English well. But secrets do not pay medical bills. When Ibrahim was diagnosed with lymphoma, there was no insurance. Sarah was 20. She dropped out of community college, took the waitressing job, and spent 18 months watching her father shrink into a shadow of himself. He died in a public hospital bed. His last words a whispered verse from Surah Yusuf, Inna naraka min al-musaneen. Indeed, we see you among those who do good. He was talking to her. She had no time to grieve because the debts were waiting, double shifts, late nights. And every memory of classical Arabic she buried deep, because speaking it reminded her of the man who was no longer there. But tonight, Khalid Al-Mansur's joke had dug up the grave. Sarah stood frozen, her tray still balanced, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked at the table where the men were still chuckling, and she saw the billionaire who had everything, mocking something he clearly no longer understood. She thought of her father's voice. She thought of the books gathering dust in her apartment, and then, before she could stop herself, she walked toward the table, set down the tray, and spoke. "Excuse me, I would like to try." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Khalid turned, his eyes narrowing, a smirk still lingering on his lips. He saw the waitress uniform, the tired face, the accent that marked her as Iraqi, not Gulf. He did not see the lifetime of training that hid behind her exhaustion. That lifetime had its shadow on the other side of the table, too. Khalid Al-Mansur had grown up in a two-room house in Basra, the son of a muezzin named Yaunis, whose voice was legendary in the old city. Yaunis called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day for 47 years, and his recitation of the Quran was so beautiful that people would gather outside the mosque just to hear the echoes. Khalid, as a boy, had sat at his father's feet and learned the same precise pronunciation, the same reverence for every syllable, but he had hated it. He saw his father's piety as weakness, a reason they had no money while others prospered. At 16, Khalid left for the Gulf, disavowed religion, and built an empire on pragmatism and ruthlessness. He had not recited a single verse with sincerity since his father died 28 years ago. Now faced with a waitress who wanted to prove him wrong, that old wound was about to crack open. He tilted his head, feigning magnanimity. "All right, let's see what you can do." He pulled out his phone, scrolled through a Quran app, and stopped at a verse he had not dared to read in nearly 3 decades, Surah Al-Isra, verse 23, the command to honor one's parents. He held up the screen, expecting her to mumble through a standard translation. Sarah looked at the Arabic script glowing on the phone. Her chest tightened. She knew this verse. She knew every layer of meaning, every alternate reading, the subtle exegesis that connected it to the concept of mercy at the root of the entire revelation. But more than that, she knew the voice her father had used when he taught it to her, the softness, the trembling reverence. She closed her eyes for one beat, and Ibrahim was there. She opened them and began. And the sound that came from her lips was not a translation. It was a bridge across time, built from the exact placement of the tongue against the palate, the precise length of the mad, the gentle stop at the end of each line. Every other conversation in the restaurant died. Khalid's smirk vanished. His companions froze, because no waitress should have been able to speak like this, like a scholar, like a reciter, like a voice preserved in amber from a world he had willfully forgotten. The first syllable hit his ears, and something shattered inside his chest. The first words she spoke were not an explanation, they were a recitation, not the casual sing-song of a student, but the precise, measured delivery of a qari, one who has spent years learning the exact weight of each consonant, the pause between the pull of breath and the rise of the next vowel. Sarah articulated each syllable with a clarity that made the classical Arabic verse feel alive, as if the 1400-year-old words had been waiting in her throat since her father planted them there. Khalid Al-Mansur's hand, still holding his phone, began to tremble. The screen displayed the verse he had impulsively chosen, but he no longer needed to look at it. He knew it. He had known it since he was a boy of 10, sitting cross-legged on a reed mat in Basra, while his father Yaunis traced the letters with a calloused finger and explained that the word qada in this verse did not merely mean decree. It carried the weight of a decision so final, so wrapped in divine love, that human language could barely hold it. And now this waitress was unfurling that exact exegesis, unprompted, in a voice that seemed to echo from the walls of his childhood mosque. Wakada rabuka Allah tabudu ila Yahuwa bil walidani isana, and your Lord has decreed that you worship none but him, and to parents goodness. But Sarah did not stop at the surface translation. She paused, her voice softening, and she explained the grammatical structure, how the divine command to worship God alone and the command to honor parents were bound by a single conjunction, as if the two were inseparable acts of devotion. She mentioned the opinion of Al-Razi, the great exegete, who said that ihsan toward parents was the highest form of service a believer could offer after faith itself. Every detail landed like a small needle into Khalid's chest. He hadn't been to his father's grave in 14 years. He had missed the funeral because a merger was closing. He had rationalized it as the cost of ambition. The restaurant had become a cathedral of silence. The head chef had stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. The other servers stood motionless, caught between their duties and the gravitational pull of what was unfolding. Even the clatter of the city beyond the windows seemed to hush. For a full 2 minutes, Sarah spoke, translating and annotating the verse, and when she finished, she looked not at the billionaire but at the space just above his head, as if her father were standing there, nodding. No one clapped. That would have been obscene. Instead, the air itself seemed to thin. Khalid's companions stared at him, waiting for a reaction. The art dealer Mahmoud nudged him and whispered, "Khalid, she's just a waiter. You made a joke, let us move on." But Khalid did not move. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, disappearing into the silver stubble along his jaw. Then another. And then he placed his phone face down on the table with the slow, deliberate motion of a man setting down a weapon. "How do you know this?" His voice cracked, scraping out of a throat that had gone dry. "You are, who taught you?" Sarah's composure flickered for the first time. She had not planned beyond the first line. She had simply stepped forward because the joke had felt like a desecration, and now a billionaire was crying at her feet metaphorically, and the entire restaurant was watching. She told him about her father, Ibrahim Jassim, a man who had swept floors by night and parsed divine linguistics by day. She told him about the cramped apartment in Rogers Park, the piles of debt, the 3 years since his death where she had locked away the language inside her because speaking it meant feeling the full vacuum of his absence. Khalid listened without interrupting. When she finished, he removed his glasses and pressed his thumb and forefinger against his eyes, a man trying to dam a flood. Then he said something that made Mahmoud's jaw unhinge. "My father, Yaunis al-Mansur, was the muezzin of Masjid al-Kawthar in Basra. For 47 years, his voice called the adhan over the old city, and every single night he would recite this exact verse, Surah Al-Isra, verse 23, before he went to sleep. He told me it was the verse that bound his soul to his own father and his father before him. I have not let myself hear it recited properly since he died. 28 years, you just. You sounded like someone I have been running from since I was 16 years old." He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. His bodyguard near the entrance tensed, but Khalid waved him back. He looked at Sarah, not as a waitress, not as a novelty, but as a messenger who had just delivered a dispatch from a life he had sealed off with concrete and wealth. "What is your name?" he asked. Sarah Ibrahim." "Sarah," he repeated, testing it. "You said your father was a scholar of Quranic linguistics. Where did he study?" Here, the evening shifted from melancholic to eerie. Sarah mentioned a name. Dr. Abdullah al-Misrai, the renowned Egyptian specialist in the 10 canonical recitations, who taught at Al-Azhar before relocating to Baghdad in the 1970s. Ibrahim Jassim had been al-Misrai's star pupil, the keeper of a particular tradition, the Warsh an-Nafi recitation, known for its poetic elongation and its connection to the early Medinan oral transmission. Sarah had learned it, syllable by syllable, from the age of 4. Khalid's face went pale. He gripped the back of his chair. "Abdullah al-Misrai," he whispered. "He visited Basra in 1982. He stayed at our home for 3 weeks. I was 12. He gave my father a handwritten ijazah, a certificate of mastery for the Warsh recitation. My father framed it. It hung above my bed. I used to stare at it and wish it would burn because it represented everything I couldn't escape. The two of them, a billionaire petroleum magnate and an orphaned Iraqi waitress were linked by a chain of teachers and reciters going back over 14 centuries to the Prophet himself. The odds of this moment were so astronomically small that the guests who overheard it would later describe it as a miracle, a collision engineered by forces beyond coincidence. Mahmoud, the art dealer, looked at his shoes, suddenly feeling like an intruder at a sacred rite. But the world outside the restaurant had no reverence for the sacred. A diner at a nearby table, a tech entrepreneur named Jordan Ellis, in town from San Francisco, had been recording the entire scene on his phone. He had started filming when Sarah first approached the table, thinking he was capturing a viral humiliation. Instead, he now held footage of a billion-dollar businessman weeping as a waitress recited scripture like a scholar. He checked the clip, 23,000 views, and it was still uploading. By the time he refreshed, it was 41,000. The pivot came before Sarah could process the enormity of what she had just learned about the ijazah. Khalid stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "I need to offer you something, not charity, restoration. I run a cultural heritage foundation. We preserve manuscripts, fund linguistic research, digitize endangered recitation traditions. I have been looking for someone who carries the Warsh chain authentically. Experts are dying. The chains are snapping. You are holding a thread that goes back to the Prophet's companions, and it is sitting in a waitress's memory, getting buried under double shifts." Sarah's first instinct was to recoil. Wealthy men and their offers had never been safe territory. She was not naive, but this was not the oily proposition of a man seeking to own her. This was a request to resurrect her father's life's work. He was asking her not to be a translator, but an archivist, a living repository. He mentioned a salary, a research fellowship, access to manuscripts her father had only dreamed of seeing. Before she could answer, three things happened in rapid succession. First, Jordan Ellis, the tech entrepreneur, walked up and showed his phone's screen, the video already at 500,000 views with comments pouring in. Second, Mahmoud grabbed Khalid's arm and hissed something in rapid Arabic about optics, about the board, about not making promises to strangers in the middle of an emotional breakdown. And third, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her landlord. Rent was overdue. She had 48 hours before eviction proceedings began. That buzz was the sound of two worlds colliding. On one side, a lineage of sacred recitation, a grieving billionaire, and a sudden global audience. On the other, a $700 debt that could make her homeless. Sarah looked at the phone, then at Khalid, then at the camera still recording. She could feel the future pulling in two directions, one that honored her father's legacy, and one that would keep her invisible and safe. And she had no idea that her answer, captured live on a 48-second clip that was now ricocheting across Arabic Twitter and English-language news sites, would transform not just her life, but the entire mission of the Al-Mansur Foundation. Because the video was not only going viral, it was reaching the very people who had known her father, and they were about to speak. The first message arrived at 2 in the morning. Sarah hadn't slept. She sat in her apartment, the eviction notice glowing on her phone alongside the video that now had over 4 million views. The message came from a retired imam in Toronto named Sheikh Bilal Farouk, a man she had never met but who had studied under Dr. Abdullah al-Misrai in Cairo during the 1970s. He wrote in Arabic, his words trembling even through text. "I saw the clip. The recitation you used, the elongation of the mad at the word, Isana, that is not standard Warsh. That is a variant I have only heard from one man in my entire life. Your father, Ibrahim Jassim. I thought that sub-branch died with him. You just proved it is alive. Do you understand what you are carrying?" She didn't, not fully. But Sheikh Farouk would spend the next 3 hours on a video call explaining it, his voice breaking repeatedly as he drew a map of recitation chains on a piece of paper and held it up to the camera. The chain Sarah had inherited, the Warsh transmission through Al-Azraq, then through a specific Andalusian line that passed through Morocco and into Baghdad, was considered extinct. Scholars had written papers about its loss. 3 doctoral dissertations had mourned it. And here it was, preserved in the muscle memory of a 23-year-old waitress who had no idea she was a living archaeological site. The revelation sent a shockwave beyond Sheikh Farouk. Within 24 hours, Academics from Al-Azhar University, Yale, and the University of Jordan began posting public statements. Linguists who specialized in Quranic transmission argued about the authenticity of her variant in comment sections that grew tens of thousands deep. The video had become something far larger than an emotional moment in a restaurant. It had become a scientific event, and that was when the attacks began. A prominent Saudi cleric with a massive online following released a 10-minute video titled "The Deception of the Waitress." He accused Sarah of being a fraud, a performer trained by some Western institution to mimic classical pronunciation without authentic ijazah. He claimed her father's chain was fabricated, that Dr. Abdullah al-Misri's records showed no such student named Ibrahim Jassim. The comments on Sarah's original video turned vicious overnight. Liar, attention seeker. Women should not recite publicly anyway. One post, translated from Arabic, read simply, "Your father was a janitor, not a scholar. Stop pretending." Sarah read that one and stopped breathing for a full 10 seconds. Because in the world of sacred recitation, an ijazah is not a degree you can print. It is a verbal certification, passed from teacher to student, often undocumented in any formal system. Her father's knowledge had never been digitized. His certification had been spoken into existence decades ago, and the only man who could definitively verify it, Dr. al-Misri, had died in 1998. Khalid al-Mansur watched the backlash from his penthouse in Manhattan, his phone buzzing with calls from his board of directors. Mahmoud had wasted no time escalating the matter to the foundation's legal team. The concern was not about Sarah's authenticity, it was about liability. If the foundation publicly employed her and the Saudi cleric's accusations gained traction, major donors in the Gulf could withdraw. A single funding partnership worth $12 million was already on the line. The chief legal counsel, a steely woman named Patricia Vance, sent Khalid an email with the subject line, "Recommendation, pause all public association with Sarah Ibrahim." Khalid ignored it. He called Sarah directly. She answered with a voice hoarse from crying. He told her about the foundation, about the dormant department he had created years ago but never staffed, the oral transmission archive, meant to record and preserve endangered recitation chains before they disappeared. He told her he didn't care about the board, the donors, or the cleric. "My father spent his life preserving what I threw away. You are the last voice in that chain, Sarah. I will fund the archive myself, personally, if the foundation pulls out. I need to know, can you prove what your father taught you?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "My father left something I never told anyone because I didn't think it mattered. When he died, the only things I kept were his 3 oldest books, the ones he brought from Baghdad. There is a box I never fully opened because it hurt too much." Khalid asked what was in the box. Her answer would dismantle the Saudi cleric's case within a week. But first, the landlord arrived. The eviction proceeding was scheduled for the next morning. Sarah had scraped together $300 but was still $400 short. She had no family in the United States, no safety net, no way to stop the legal machinery. Her roommates, 2 women she barely knew, had already packed their things. The apartment, with its rattling radiator and water-stained ceiling, was about to become a memory. And yet, at the same moment, the landlord's notice was taped to her door. A courier arrived from a law firm representing Khalid al-Mansur. Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $15,000, a letter offering her a salaried position as lead archivist of the Oral Transmission Archive, and a handwritten note from Khalid. "This is not charity. It is a down payment on a debt my father's tradition owes yours. Pay your rent, then come prove the world wrong." The worst turn came not from the public attacks, but from the box. Sarah, now with a temporary roof still over her head, finally opened the container she had sealed on the day her father died. Inside were not just 3 books. There were 17, handwritten. Thousands of pages of Ibrahim Jassim's personal commentary, comparison of all 10 canonical recitations, and a complete documentation of the Warsh chain with every sub-branch mapped in his meticulous handwriting. And tucked inside the back cover of the oldest volume was a piece of paper that made Sarah's hands shake. It was a photocopy of a handwritten ijazah, dated 1982, bearing the signature of Dr. Abdullah al-Misri. The original had been left in Basra, framed in the home of a muezzin named Younis. But this photocopy was a direct acknowledgement that Ibrahim Jassim was a certified master of the Warsh recitation, authorized to teach and transmit. The document was scanned and sent to academic verifiers within hours. Sheikh Farouk authenticated the handwriting from old correspondence. Al-Azhar's linguistics department released a preliminary statement calling the find significant. The Saudi cleric's video was suddenly flooded with demands for retraction, but the damage had spread. Sarah's private life was now public property. Her father's memory was being debated by strangers. The Foundation's board, though temporarily quieted, was still watching. Mahmoud, speaking privately to Khalid, warned that the real threat was not the online backlash, but the quiet disapproval of conservative donors who considered a woman's public recitation, even with an authentic ijazah, to be inappropriate. "You are not just hiring an archivist," he said. "You are staging a cultural confrontation." Khalid's response was immediate. "Then we stage it completely." He proposed a live event. A full recitation and academic defense held at the Foundation's auditorium in New York, streamed globally, with Sarah presenting her father's work and demonstrating the Warsh variant before a panel of neutral scholars. It was a gamble of staggering proportions. If she succeeded, the archive would be launched with unassailable legitimacy. If she failed, the Foundation could fracture and Sarah would be publicly disgraced. The panel would include linguists from Al-Azhar, a representative of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, and at the insistence of the Foundation's board, a skeptic chosen by the Saudi Clerics Organization. Sarah agreed, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because the alternative was to let her father's life work become a footnote in a controversy. The event was set for 3 weeks later. She spent those weeks in Khalid's Foundation offices, poring over her father's manuscripts with a small team of researchers. They discovered layers of scholarship she had never known existed, cross-references to early Andalusian grammarians, corrections to contemporary Western translations, a whole chapter on how the Warsh elongation changed the semantic field of Divine Mercy verses. Her father had not just been a student. He had been a scholar producing original work that could shift the academic landscape. But the night before the event, as Sarah sat alone in the Foundation's library, a new message arrived. This one was not from a supporter or a critic. It was from a man named Omar al-Khatib, a former colleague of her father from Baghdad who had been presumed dead for 15 years. He had seen the video, heard the recitation, and recognized the exact phrasing. He wrote, "Ibrahim and I worked on a secret project in 2003, just before the invasion. It was a complete audio recording of all 10 Qur'at, done in a soundproof room we built beneath a mosque. The tapes were buried before we fled. I know where they are. If you survive tomorrow, I will tell you." The morning of the live event, Sarah woke before dawn and could not eat. She stood at the window of her new apartment, a small but clean unit near the Foundation's offices, paid for by the first month of her salary, and stared at the Manhattan skyline. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a waitress facing eviction. Now she carried 17 handwritten manuscripts, a photocopied ijazah, and the weight of a 1,000-year-old recitation chain on her shoulders. Outside the auditorium, the line of attendees stretched 2 city blocks. Sheikhs, academics, journalists, and skeptics had traveled from Cairo, London, Kuala Lumpur, and Riyadh. The hashtag waitress reciter was trending globally. Khalid met her backstage. He looked older, the strain of the past weeks etched into his face. The board had issued a final ultimatum. If the event triggered a donor exodus, he would step down as chairman. He had not told Sarah this. Instead, he handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a silver pendant engraved with the opening verse of Surah Al-Isra, the same verse she had recited in the restaurant. "My father gave this to my mother," Khalid said. "She always said the best reciters carry the verse not in their mouths, but in their bones. You do, now go prove it." The auditorium seated 600, with overflow screens in the lobby. The panel was 5 scholars. Sheikh Farouk represented the traditional ijazah system. Dr. Miriam Steiner, a linguistic anthropologist from Oxford, represented Western academia. The Al-Azhar appointee, Professor Tariq Al-Ghamdi, was a moderate voice known for meticulous authentication. The fourth panelist was a computer scientist who specialized in acoustic phonetics, there to analyze the sonic patterns of Sarah's recitation against archival recordings of known Warsh masters. And the fifth was the skeptic, a stern, gray-bearded scholar nominated by the Saudi Clerics Organization, a man named Sheikh Abdul Malik, who had publicly stated that women's recitations were not admissible as evidence. Sarah took the stage at 10 in the morning. The lights were blinding. She wore a simple black hijab and a gray dress, no ornamentation, no effort to appear as anything other than what she was, a woman who had learned at her father's feet and was about to defend his name before the world. She began not with an argument, but with recitation. She recited the same verse from Al-Andalus restaurant, but this time she extended it, moving through the next 3 verses of Surah Al-Isra, pausing at the places where her father had taught her to pause, elongating the vowels in the precise patterns of the extinct Andalusian sub-branch. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room completely. The acoustic phoneticist leaned forward, his eyes fixed on a spectrogram displayed on his laptop. He had loaded recordings of 3 masters of the Warsh chain from the early 20th century, digitized from wax cylinders and magnetic tapes. As Sarah recited, the software mapped her frequency patterns in real time. The visual match was so precise, down to the millisecond of breath control, the harmonic overtones of the uvular consonants, that he later told the panel it was statistically indistinguishable from the archival masters. He had expected a competent imitation. He had found a direct oral inheritance. Sheikh Abdul Malik cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He asked her to parse a notoriously ambiguous grammatical construction in Surah Al-Baqarah. She did, citing 3 classical commentaries and explaining the morphological disagreement between the Basran and Kufan schools. He demanded she demonstrate the difference between the Warsh and Hafs recitations on the word Maliki in the Fatiha, the difference between king and owner that hinged on a single vowel. She not only demonstrated it, but traced the theological implications of both readings back to the earliest Meccan manuscripts. He asked for the chain of transmission, name by name. She recited it back to him, 27 names, each teacher to student, ending with her own. And from me, Sarah Ibrahim, daughter of Ibrahim Jassim, authorized by Dr. Abdullah Al-Misrai by Ijazah dated 1982 in Basra. Sheikh Abdul Malik removed his glasses. His hands were shaking, but not with anger. When I was a boy in Dammam, he said quietly, I attended a recitation circle led by an elderly man who had studied in Medina. He used to weep at the word Isana because of what he said was a lost melodic pattern that once broke the hearts of those who heard it. I have never heard that pattern until now. He paused, the silence thick. The chain is authentic. I withdraw all previous statements. The auditorium erupted. The applause did not stop for 2 minutes. The live stream hit 7 million concurrent viewers. Sheikh Farouk, weeping openly, approached the microphone and declared that the oral transmission archive was not merely a foundation project. It was a sacred trust that the Muslim world must support. By the end of the day, 7 major Islamic universities had pledged cooperation. The board members who had threatened withdrawal quietly rescinded their objections. The Saudi cleric who had called Sarah a fraud released a corrected statement, though it was tepid and face-saving. The damage to his credibility was permanent, but the real resolution came after the cameras turned off. Sarah sat in a quiet office with Khalid, the pendants from both their parents now hanging around her neck. She told him about the message from Omar al-Khatib, the man who had been presumed dead for 15 years. Khalid listened without interruption, and when she finished, he made a single phone call. Within 72 hours, a team was dispatched to Baghdad, to the coordinates Omar had provided, the ruins of a mosque in the Al-Adhamiyah district, beneath which a soundproof basement had been dug in the frantic months before the invasion. They found the room. It had flooded, and most of the equipment was destroyed. But a metal footlocker, sealed with wax and prayer, had survived. Inside were 68 reel-to-reel tapes, mold damaged but recoverable. They contain the complete audio recording of all 10 canonical Quranic recitations, recorded by Ibrahim Jassim and his colleagues 2 decades ago, the only complete comparative recording of its kind in existence. When the archivists played the first restored track, Ibrahim's voice reciting Surah Maryam in the wash mode, Sarah collapsed into a chair. She was 9 again, in the cramped apartment in Rogers Park, the radiator hissing. He was there with her, his voice exactly as she remembered, the pauses exactly where she had learned them. The tapes would take years to fully restore and catalogue, but they were the genesis of the archive. Sarah's father had built a library beneath a war zone, and his daughter had brought it into the light. The final surprising detail came 3 months later, when the archivists were cleaning the last of the tapes. Tucked into the real case labeled Callan 4 was a small notebook, its pages water-stained but legible. It was a diary Ibrahim had kept in the weeks before the invasion. The last entry, dated March 18, 2003, the day before the bombing began, was addressed to Sarah. "My daughter is 6 years old as I write this. I do not know if she will ever read these words. But if she does, I want her to know, the language you are learning is a rope from heaven. Hold tight to it, and it will pull you out of any darkness. I'm not afraid of what is coming, because I see you, grown, somewhere safe, still reciting, and I am proud." Sarah read it with tears she had not shed since the funeral. The grief that had buried her father was still there, but it had transformed. She was no longer a woman fleeing debt and invisibility. She was the guardian of a chain that had survived war, poverty, and decades of doubt. The foundation announced the establishment of the Ibrahim Jassim Fellowship, funding specialists from displaced communities to train in the preservation of oral recitation traditions. Sarah would lead it. The first fellow was a young woman from Aleppo, whose father had also been a reciter killed in the war. The chain was growing again. On the 1-year anniversary of the restaurant encounter, Khalid returned to Al-Andalus. He did not announce his visit. He sat at the same corner table, ordered the same pomegranate juice, and looked at the same spot where Sarah had stood. He was no longer the man who had laughed at the idea of a waitress translating scripture. He had funded 17 archival projects, digitized over 2,000 hours of rare recitation, and reconciled with his sons, who now sat on the foundation's board. He took out his phone and scrolled to a video he had saved, the first clip, filmed by Jordan Ellis, now with 73 million views. He watched it without sound, just the image of Sarah's face, calm and resolute, and the moment his own tears began. He put the phone away and bowed his head. He was not praying, he was thanking. Not God exactly, but the strange architecture of coincidence and loss that had brought a dead man's voice back to life through his daughter. In the end, the billionaire did not hire the waitress. He did something far more radical. He stepped aside and let her lead. The oral transmission archive, once a line item in a foundation budget that no one quite understood, now employs 14 researchers, has digitized over 3,000 hours of rare recitation, and holds the largest comparative database of Quranic recitation variants in the world. The tapes pulled from a flooded basement in Baghdad are still being restored, and each time a new track is cleaned and catalogued, Sarah hears a piece of her father she thought was lost forever. The chain did not break. It found new hands, but the question that lingers is not about Sarah, it is about everyone else. How many other chains of knowledge are buried right now, in restaurant kitchens, in taxi cabs, in the memories of displaced people who carry entire libraries inside their heads and have no one to listen? The story of the waitress who translated classical Arabic left a billionaire in tears, not because it was exceptional, but because it was invisible. The world had decided that wisdom looks a certain way, speaks with a certain accent, and carries a certain price tag. And the world was wrong. Khalid Al-Mansur still visits his father's grave every month now. He recites the verse he once mocked, and he no longer feels the sting of guilt, only the ache of a love that took decades to understand. The foundation has expanded its mission to include oral preservation projects across 12 countries, from Rohingya camps in Bangladesh to Eritrean communities in Europe, and every project begins with the same assumption: the people you least expect are likely carrying the thing you most need. What would you have done if you were sitting at that table? Would you have dismissed the waitress, laughed at the joke, and gone on with your evening, never knowing what you had missed? That is the heart of this story. Not the recitation, not the tears, not even the archive. The heart is the moment before the first word was spoken, when Sarah could have stayed invisible and the world would never have known what her father had preserved. She chose to speak. And that choice, that single act of refusing to let the knowledge die, is something any of us can make. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their hidden skill, their forgotten language, their grandmother's technique, whatever it is, has value beyond measure. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that find the extraordinary in the ordinary places. And tell us in the comments, what is one thing you learned from a parent or grandparent that you never thought the world would need, but you still carry anyway? The answer might surprise you. Because the world does not need more billionaires. It needs more people willing to open their mouths and let the buried things speak.